Hello and welcome to Brainy Books. You might notice before we go on a new set. We're always upping the ante here. Today we're going to do a first nonfiction book of, I would say, one of our country's most respected fiction writers, Richard Ford. Richard Ford. He is a quirky guy, a different guy. We're talking about him today because of his memoir of his parents, Between Them. Here is the book. Remembering My Parents, Between Them by Richard Ford. And you will notice always on any book that he writes, you're going to see winner of the Pulitzer Prize. That's why it's good to win the Pulitzer Prize. Like, it's good to be king.
It's good to be the king.
Everything you write after that gets that put right on the cover. He won the Pulitzer Prize for the middle book of a series of 3 books that he wrote. The first one was called The Sports Writer. It was his last pretty desperate attempt, as he says it, at making himself a successful fiction writer. He was personally a sports writer at the time, got fired from that job, went home, and decided I'll try one last time, and wrote a novel called The Sports Writer, which was huge success. He followed it up because he invented this character, Frank Bascom. Frank Bascom, I would say, is second in line to Rabbit from John Updike, of men who epitomize American manhood. Frank Bascom shows the ups and downs of a man in his career, the ups and downs of a man in his romantic life, his marriage, and the ups and downs of getting older, if there are any ups in that. But there are. And that is who Frank Bascom is. And this series of 3 books, for which this middle one, Independence Day, won the Pulitzer Prize, it ranks very, very high in American literature. And we're going to hear a little about Frank Bascom.
You created this guy 30 years ago.
Started creating him in 1982. Easter Day, 1982. I remember very well the first time I wrote a line down on the page, Easter Day. So therefore, the book is set at Easter time.
Mm-hmm. And what made you create this guy? What was the thought that popped into
Well,
your...
Thoreau says that a writer is a man who, having nothing to do, finds something to do. I had nothing else to do, and I had been writing novels. It was in '82, so I had been writing novels for 13 or so years, a long time anyway. Is that right? Yeah, a long time. And I wrote 2 novels, and nobody read them. And then I quit being a novelist and started being a sports writer and a journalist. And then I lost that job. And so Christina and I were living in Princeton, New Jersey, which is south of New York City. And I came back down to Princeton and said to Christina, I said, well, I don't have a job anymore. I'm thrown back on my resources, whatever they are. And I said, I'm thinking maybe I'll write a novel. And she said the most important thing anybody has ever said to me. She said, well, why don't you write a novel about somebody who's happy for a change?
But the book we're talking about today are not the Frank Bascom books. Richard Ford is established now. The book that we're talking about today, he's in his 70s, is something that he said he would never do, but he's done it. And this seems to happen as people get older. It is this remembrance of his parents, a truly remarkable book because it's very, very short, very small. He divided it up into 2 sections. The first section, you could call it a novella, remembrance of his father. Second section, remembrance of his mother. And it's a short book, but so moving to me, and I think so beautifully written. But as usual, let's let Richard Ford talk about it a little bit.
Writing a memoir about my parents, Parker and Edna Ford, didn't seem to be so much writing about myself as about them, although I was their only child. and the only one remaining to say that they'd even existed. So here's another reason to write a memoir: to utter what must not be erased. I wrote about my parents because decades after their deaths and when I was no longer young, I realized that I plainly missed them and wished in some way to draw them near me again. Writing about them would do that, I thought.
So you might wonder about the critical reception of this, his first nonfiction book, and it's a memoir. In general, received excellent reviews. But I just want to take a moment to talk about, because you've now seen Richard Ford, very attractive man, very articulate. But I just want to take a moment to give you this interesting anecdote, I guess we will call it, about Richard Ford and criticism. Years ago, Colson Whitehead, who you will know, wrote The Underground Railroad and is now considered, I'd say, the author du jour. I mean, he is the biggest author going right now after Underground Railroad. But years ago, he's been around a while, he reviewed a book of short stories by Richard Ford and did not review it well. Richard Ford was livid, and apparently when he gets bad reviews, he lets the person know how he's feeling about it. Another woman who reviews books in England received in the mail a copy of her recent book with bullet holes in it after she badly reviewed a book of Richard Ford's. So apparently he then took her book out behind his house and did target practice on it and then wrapped it up and sent it to her in England. I think this is just interesting as we go through this and we see him and we hear him talking. There is an underlayer of, I mean, this is pretty excessive. This is pretty thin-skinned. But behind this incident with Colson Whitehead, apparently The Guardian in England, which digs up everything, dug up the background for this. I'm going to read it to you as The Guardian talks about it. So Ford is a Southern writer. Ford is a man in his 70s. This is a quote from The Guardian. "Rumbling unpleasantly beneath these exchanges is an accusation Ford once leveled at his own younger self. And that, as a Mississippi-born white male writer of a certain vintage, he has had to educate himself out of centuries of racial prejudice." So, my God, here it all comes up again. This black-white thing in our country. Because he was a Southern-born writer, obviously, who grew up in a total different South, he has had to make adjustment. Colson Whitehead, I don't know. Ford is, I think, thinking you're holding this against me, gave me a bad review. Colson Whitehead said, no, I just didn't think the book was that good. But behind that comes this talk that many people knew that Richard Ford had started out as a white boy from the South and has had to re-educate himself, as many people in the United States have. He once wrote about an excursion he made with a friend going up the Mississippi River. And this is what he said. Ford admitted that he'd recently remembered some letters from the early 80s that he'd written, full of gossipy, writerly, often adolescent-seeming boisterousness, in which he'd expressed himself using offensive racial slurs. I'm just always surprised at how deep all this stuff goes. Ford says, "I was certainly a little racist as a teenager, even if not a very committed one." And he recalled in a prolonged mea culpa that it would be pretty much unpublishable today, the things that he wrote then. The problem with the internet age that we live in is that once you utter something or once you write something now, the terms of these debates is there and it will go on, and there is no erasure of everything. So I am trying to say Colson Whitehead, of course, has read these earlier things he wrote somewhere, Ford wrote. This just goes on and on. wrote the bad review, and this is the bad review like 10, 15 years ago of Richard Ford's book. So recently, this book comes out, and Colson Whitehead is at a gathering, and Richard Ford is there with his wife. Richard Ford, who looks delightfully civilized to me, and somebody, you know, that you would not expect, goes up to Colson Whitehead and spits on him. This is recent. I just want you to know this. So we are talking about complicated people, as we all are. Normally, the spitting is, we've learned not to do that. But this is just a small aspect of Richard Ford that I do want you to know. The shooting at books and spitting on people. Colson Whitehead kind of laughed it off. And if you want to read on the internet, you will. I mean, in the New York Times, they were saying, come on, Richard Ford, time to forget all this. So now let's get on to Between Them. And the critical reviews of it, which, as I mentioned before, were mostly extremely positive. Cheryl Strayed, you know her from Wild, her book Wild. Reese Witherspoon, the movie. Okay, so she reviewed this book for the New York Times. I'm going to very briefly read some of her review. Between Them, Remembering My Parents. Novellas, together they form an illuminating portrait of a slightly unconventional white couple born in the early years of the 20th century. With a depth of perception that's both affectionate and insightful, Ford tells the stories of his parents' lives and deaths in turn. This is the always interesting subject of children and parents. Do we really know our parents? Is it possible? I mean, they appear in our lives as gods. Can we ever really know our parents on a different level? This is really what I find interesting in this book. I'm going back to what Cheryl says, though. In showing his mother and father to us, Ford, an ordinary child who grew up to become one of our most distinguished fiction writers, has inevitably shown a fair portrait of himself. A lot of that is done by the way Ford, looking outward rather than inward, he looks what was happening around to show us what was going on inside. Between Them is driven by his, and I think this is crucial, his curiosity. He wanted to know, who were my parents? What were they like? It's very hard to separate this in our heads. In retrospect, he imagines they might have been really beyond his view. It's through this innate desire to know, curiosity to know, paired with his exceptional abilities as a prose craftsman. These two very ordinary people are made vital and vivid to us on the page. And they were so ordinary. They're almost heartbreakingly ordinary. His depictions and examination of his parents before and after he was born, their mannerisms and bearings, their wounds and silences, their squabbles and pleasures, offer a masterclass in character development and narrative economy. His parents, mine has been a life of noticing and being a witness, he says. Is that interesting? He's a writer. His whole life is of noticing and being a witness. Isn't that what writers, filmmakers, isn't that maybe what artists are? Making them different from other people? But this noticing takes on a different shade in the book Between Them. There's a vulnerability that Cheryl Strayed says she's not observed in Ford's work before, a tender surrender to the search. So what makes the book so moving is his engagement with the unknowable. And this paradoxically, for a memoir, it's fiction, after all, that a writer has the luxury of omniscience. He's a fiction writer. That's why people write fiction, because you can say anything. You can create a character to say something. He can't do that here. I mean, he's trying to get the facts down here. This is nonfiction. So there is no who, where, what, why in this. He's just presenting the facts, and we're going to figure them out.
I mean, I'll tell you, the first art I ever encountered as a boy was, by which I mean the first art that I ever experienced, was sitting on Howlin' Wolf's amplifier at a blues concert in Oxford, Mississippi in 1961. And you watch Howlin' Wolf, you see pictures of Howlin' Wolf playing his harmonica, or Howlin' Wolf just being this big bear of a man that he was. I thought to myself, I don't know, I shouldn't say I thought to myself. I was impressed by the fact that this is a physical thing to do. It's a physical thing to make the blues, to make art in that way. And that's the way I've kind of always gone at it. I mean, you're supposed to, Hemingway always says, you know, don't let them see you sweat. And I don't want them to see me sweat, but I don't mind sweating in order that they not see me sweat.
Ford did an extensive interview with Vanity Fair about between them, and they discussed some really interesting things. He explained, of course, that he wrote the memoir about his mother first in 1981, right after she died. He was very, very close with his mother, as we know. His father had died when he was 16, and he was never close with him because he was not home a lot. But what I found really interesting, what he told Vanity Fair, he now lives in Booth Bay, Maine, and he said he couldn't get this thing written about his father. He tried to write about his father many times. It never would go. What he had to do, this is just interesting, is rent a small office in Booth Bay, which isn't a big place, leave his house, go to this office, sit there with his computer. And he said he still couldn't do it. And finally, but he knew he had to remove himself from the house, go there. Finally, he started one day, and he was able to do it. But I think if you have read or when you do read it, you'll see it doesn't flow as easily as the essay about his mother. But in a way, it's almost more intriguing to me. It's just something interesting. Here is his comment about trying to write about his father. And again, his father died. He was giving him all sorts of life resuscitating measures. So the 16-year-old Richard Ford was holding his father when he died. So he says, talking about his father, this I found fascinating. He says, I once wrote a line in some book about the applauseless, no applause, the applauseless life of people. My father lived an applauseless life. That doesn't mean, though, that it was without virtues. Part of what I was doing when I wrote this piece about him was that I was trying to winkle out of my imagination and his behavior what was virtuous about him. And I found a couple of things. And this I find really beautiful. This is what he found about his father when he remembered him. He said he was happy to come home at night. He was very good at being loved. He didn't have a lot of other skills. He couldn't do much else. But people loved him. They adored him. He was good. I don't know anybody who disliked him. I think that is a talent. I can't remember anybody disliking my father. I adored him, my mother adored him, his mother adored him, his nieces and nephews adored him. That's a lucky life. Well, I find this extremely interesting coming from somebody, which is why I sort of went into the detail about who Richard Ford is, with the thin skin and spitting in people's faces. I find it adds a great deal to how he feels about his father. There was a very interesting review in the Washington Post of this book, which was not nearly so full of praise as the New York Times review. And this review I found puzzling to me. The reviewer speaks of him not drawing conclusions about his parents' life, not analyzing how this affected him. This is not what a memoir necessarily needs to do. I thought the memoir was absolutely beautiful in that it was so restrained, it was so elegant, it was so full of grace, And after all, he's not writing a review to judge his parents. I want to read a couple of things from it that really impressed me. This, I think, is the most beautiful, most telling passage in the whole book. I have heard Richard Ford read it, and he ended up in tears after reading it. This is my answer to the Washington Post reviewer. You don't need to go into all this analysis and detail. Richard Ford just writes it so simply. This is what he's famous for. He's talking about his mother now, and near the very end of her life, they're talking. On a sunny day in early November, when she'd been with me, staying with him, visiting, for 3 weeks or so, she said, "Richard, I'm not sure how much longer I can look after myself. I'm sorry, but it's just the truth." "Does it worry you?" I said. "Well," my mother said, "I'm not scheduled to go into Presbyterian Village," the home she was going to, "until next year, and I'm not quite sure what I'm going to be able to do until then." "What would you like to do?" I said. She looked away then out the window, down the hill, where the trees were bare and fog was shifting. "I don't know exactly," she said. "Maybe you'll start to feel better," I said. "Well, yes, I could. I suppose it's not impossible," she said. "I think it's possible," I said. I do. "Well, okay," Mother said. "If you don't," I said, "if by Christmas you don't feel you can do everything for yourself, you can move in with us. I'm going back to Princeton. You can live here." And I saw in my mother's eyes then a light, a kind of light, anyway. Recognition, concession, willingness, reprieve of another kind. "Are you sure about that?" she said, and looked at me uncertainly. My mother's eyes were very brown. "Yes, I'm sure," I said. "You're my mother. I love you." "Well," she said, and nodded, took in a breath, let it out. No tears. "I'll begin to think toward that then. I'll make some plans about my furniture." "Well, wait, though," I said. And this is a sentence I wish, above all sentences in my life, I had never said. Words I wish I'd never heard. I said, "Well, don't make your plans yet," I said. "You might feel better by then. It might not be necessary to come to Princeton." "Oh," my mother said. And whatever had suddenly put a light in her eyes suddenly went away, and her worries resumed. What might lie between now and later rose again. "I see," she said. "All right." That takes quite a bit for a writer to put in words. I mean, it was a terrible moment. He did something that he wished he hadn't done. He didn't have to put that in the book. And we don't have to analyze it. People can figure that out. The simplicity of language, which he's famous for, but which really works well in this book, I think is wonderful. We live in an age where people talk about branding, a phrase I wish had never come into being. Branding, authenticity. This is just a really simple, very, very simply stated accounting of two people's lives, and they were two very ordinary, average people. And there is no branding here, no nothing. This is just a story about two people coping and how their son saw their life and how he sees it now from his vantage point of 70 years. It's just a beautiful little memoir. Thanks for joining me. I hope you'll give this little book the time it deserves. Next week, we're going to do another autobiography. Trevor Noah, the late night personality. The book is Born a Crime, totally different view of life. I also hope that you will subscribe to Brainy Classes, and then you ring the bell next to it, and I'll see you then.